Yeah, you could be up there already. Yeah. Is that comfortable?
Yeah, that's
fine. Before I start the actual introduction, I just wanted to mention that we will have a reception at the Roundhouse afterwards with wine and chocolate. Significantly earlier than last time. So before I make the introduction of our special guests, there are other VIPs here that I'd like to mention. Taryn Wolf is here. Who's here? Sorry?
I was here last week.
I know, but like, there are people here who weren't here last.
Sorry.
So, Taryn Wolf,
Thanks, Mike.
Director of Academic Admissions, Yale School of Art. Here from New Haven. Jack Beecher, Director of Operations for the Ellen Battell Settle Trust. And last but not least, Joe Hurst from the Norfolk Foundation, which has very graciously and generously supported this lecture series. So, Silas Munro holds a BFA from Rhode Island School of Design and an MFA from Cal Arts. He has earned a design fellowship at the Walker Art Center and been a designer in residence at NC State and design director at Housing Works. Munro's design studio Polymode has designed identities and publications for exhibitions of Jacob Lawrence at MoMA, Mark Bradford at the 2017 Venice Biennale, and a forthcoming commission, Great Force, for the ICA at VCU in 2019. Munro's writing appears in Slanted, The Walker Reader, and the book W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, published by Princeton Architectural Press. Munro has shown in group shows at Cal Arts and RISD and has served as a critic at Cal Arts, MICA, VCU, and Yale School of Art. Munro is assistant professor at Otis College of Art and Design and advisor and former chair at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And Silas will elaborate on W.E.B. Du Bois's data portraits presented at the 1900 Paris exposition. It's been really fun getting to know Silas over the last 36 hours, and we're so glad you're here. Please welcome Silas Munro.
Byron and Lisa, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here at the Yale Norfolk School of Art. Not only have I been humbled and impressed with the students, faculty, and staff, but just the grounds are spectacular here. So beautiful. Actually, yesterday I took a red eye to come here from LA, and it was a pretty long day, so I took a break and got on a bike that's here on campus, and I rode down to that pond you all have here, and ended up taking a dip in the water, but I didn't have my bathing suit, so I was skinny dipping and like swam out to the dock and fell asleep and was taking a nap. And then I woke up to these two guys who were on the shore drinking beers. I don't think they really noticed me or they didn't pay attention to me, but I kind of like swam into the water really quick and grabbed my towel and got dressed. But anyways, it was very relaxing and awesome. This was pretty cool. So I'm very relaxed. Hopefully, I'm glad I didn't get a ticket. A little inside joke for the students. I'm here to share some research about W.E.B. Du Bois that's very close to my heart. It's close because it's about art and design, which I love, and it's close to my heart because it's about identity and humanity that transcends race, color, creed, gender, nationality, and sexuality. It's about using form to turn data into a kind of utopia, or at least the hope for utopia. The research I present today is collaborative and is the product of my contribution, as Byron mentioned, to W.E.B. Du Bois' Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America. This is a book that's edited by Britt Russert and Whitney Battle-Baptiste. This is what the book looks like. They're scholars of Du Bois, and they teach African American history and culture at UMass Amherst. That's where Du Bois's papers are stored. And actually, strangely enough, we are 30 minutes drive south of Great Barrington, which is the birthplace of W.E.B. Du Bois. And actually, a few students and I are going to go up there tomorrow for a seminar on the road, which I'm pretty excited about. Also in the book are additional essays by Mabel O. Wilson, who's an amazing architectural critic and professor at Columbia. She wrote a book called Negro Buildings, which is very important. If you're interested in going deeper, you should check it out. It's about African Americans in World's Fairs and museums. And then also Alden Morris. He's the foremost living scholar on Du Bois. He wrote a book called The Scholar Denied, which talks about how Du Bois's research as a sociologist has been erased by his own discipline. And our book is published by Princeton Architectural Press, and I'm going to channel RuPaul and say you can order it on Amazon if you like, or wherever fine books are sold. And speaking of plugs, one of the things I've been trying to do when I speak or just talk about anything is to signal boost other designers and artists. So as you see, there's typography that's on the slides, and that is a beta version of a typeface that Trey Seals, really brilliant young type designer of color who runs a studio called Vocal Type. So he has gone quite far and is still refining a digitization of a family of typefaces that's based on the lettering in these plates by Du Bois, and he has a website. So the typeface is not available yet, but it will be later this year, and my studio is actually using it for the exhibition catalog and exhibition for that Great Force show that was mentioned. And I'll be closing with a quote about Great Force, which I'll get into at the end, but look for that. Also, if you're interested in sharing about the lecture or contacting me, there's my handle, Cyborg81, on Twitter, Instagram, however you want to share. Because I think this is important research, and I will go anywhere, speak anywhere about this, including a library in Palms in Los Angeles. So I'm really honored to be here. So I have a couple questions for you. Can I take you on a journey? Yes. One through time and space. Okay, good. Before I do need to give a trigger warning. I will be using historical terms that were appropriate to the time they were said, but conflict with our contemporary language. I will also use humor, gallows humor really, in my talk to ground some of the darkness that I face in this work and research. So that's really important to me. And since it's dinner time, I thought I would present you a menu. And these plates are so complex, there's so many aspects to them, it's important that I course it out for you. So, we will begin with an amuse-bouche called the color line, which is followed by an appetizer called the Negro exhibit. Then we have a very ample two-part entree called the Georgia Negro and a series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves, now residents in the United States of America. That's a mouthful. The second part, I'll just call it the series, probably as I go forward. That's the full name of it. So there are two different sets that are related. Then for dessert, I'm going to be talking about my own art and design history, which I think is important as the narrator of this evening. And, with a grain of salt, I'm a practitioner, I'm trained as a practitioner of design, so I come to history with a particular framework, and also come with a personal framework as well because of a number of factors. And then just to wash it all down, we have a digestive, which is the contemporary impact of these plates. And so I'm going to talk about a project called W.E.B that I did in Philadelphia with a small group of students at University of the Arts. I'm going to talk about the work of Theaster Gates in response to this, as well as a bit of text from James Baldwin to close it out. You ready? You hungry? Okay. So we start here with our moves. So the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That is one of W.E.B. Du Bois's most famous quotes. And I call him Du Bois, that's how he said his name, even though he has the French Du Bois, but that's what he preferred. Widely known to be a prolific author, renowned sociologist, fierce civil rights advocate, co-founder of the NAACP, and historian of Black lives, W.E.B. Du Bois was also a pioneer of data visualization. So he actually published this quote in a book, his most famous text, called Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. And it's a quote that cuts through the intersection of race and class, but he also mentioned this quote in a lecture in 1900, and that's an important date because it also shows up in the plates, and we'll look at a detail of that later. And I think what's so interesting about this body of work that I'm going to show, these are the 63 drawings that he made with his students that were exhibited in 1900. And so to me, looking at these thumbnails, this notion of a color line is very literal and metaphorical. And in ways, this contribution of these 60 plus data visualizations or infographics that he exhibits at the Exposition Universelle is really about this idea of progress by African Americans. And the materials are quite varied. These are made with ink, gouache, watercolor, graphite, and sprinklings of photographic prints. And he made them with both students and alumni collaborators where he taught at the time at Atlanta University. And they have this crisp, dynamic, and modern graphic form that I argue is a form of infographic activism. Okay, ready for your next course? Okay, good. This is the appetizer. So all of this work was displayed in an exhibit that was also designed by Du Bois and a number of collaborators, and it was exhibited in 1900 in Paris. This is what Du Bois was looking like at the time in his top hat and coattails. Note the baller headgear. He came styling. And his full name, William Edward Burgert Du Bois, he was called Webb to his friends, because it's a mouthful to say the rest of it. And he was born in 1868, 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation began to free slaves in America. And this is what he says about himself, and we're in the perfect setting for this. He says, "In general thought and conduct, I became quite thoroughly New England." He was raised by his single mother and grandmother. He went to Fisk University in Tennessee, then to Harvard for a second BA and a PhD in sociology, and he was the first black man to do this. He studied abroad in Berlin before this picture was taken, so he would have already been familiar with Europe. To put the exhibit together, he actually collaborated with a couple of key individuals. The most important one to talk about is a man named Thomas Junius Calloway, who was a lawyer, educator. He was a graduate of Fisk University, so Du Bois would have known him from there. He was also the editor of a very important publication, a newspaper in DC called The Colored American. And Calloway, with the endorsement and assistance of W.E.B. Du Bois's frenemy, Booker T. Washington. Yes, everyone can relate to that. Petitioned the United States government to include in a display at the World's Fair industrial and imperial prowess, as well as its commitment to social reform, an exhibit dedicated to African American life. And so this American Negro exhibit featured many contributions by students and faculty at their various institutions, the Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, the Hampton Institute, and other black colleges and industrial schools. And Calloway reached out to Du Bois, who was his classmate, in the hopes that he would be willing to contribute a social study about African American life in the exhibit. And I'm not going to talk about this, but he had already designed and executed a very complex study, actually the first contemporary sociological study called the Philadelphia Negro in 1897, 1898, when Edith Wharton of Penn, through a white sociologist, invited Du Bois to do the study of the 10th Ward. So he had already done a bunch of research, which actually include charts and visualizations that I'm not going to show, but definitely influenced these pieces. And so this idea of Du Bois working with Booker T. Washington, who was this Southern agrarian accommodationist, didn't really sit well with this thoroughly New England, Northern radical intellectual Du Bois. And so there was kind of a lot of tension between them. Another bit of tension is they didn't really get the commission until 1899. They were kind of figuring out details, months before the exhibition, 1898, 89. So he began assembling the exhibit actually in December, December 28th of 1899, and the exposition began on April 15th. So plus the 6 weeks it would take the works to travel by ship, he did not have very much time. And so Du Bois, after talking with Calloway, went back to Atlanta University, and he created the charts with both women and men of color that he taught. So this is not his students, but this is an image of students at Clarion University in Orangeburg, South Carolina, using letterpress and assembling a publication. So the workroom, war room for this project probably looks something like this. And there were just multiple forms of collaboration and co-creation, and the diagrams talk specifically about and present the work as a collective effort by Atlanta University. There was an alumnus, William Andrew Rogers, who had recently received his bachelor's degree in sociology, and he was most likely the point person responsible for making and coordinating the design and production of the actual graphics. Few records remain about the working methods of Rogers, and he may have been living in Petersburg, Virginia while he worked on the project. But based on the volume of the designs, each piece's complexity and detail, and the compressed project timeline of only a few months to prepare their portion of the American Negro exhibit, it seems implausible that Rogers and Du Bois worked alone to complete it. Rogers and Du Bois no doubt facilitated renderings and typesetting from additional unnamed Atlanta University students and alumni who also were collecting the field data. So here's another picture. This is actually at Atlanta University between 1899 and 1900, and I just think it's really important. In Britt and Whitney's essay, they talk more about this. I'm just going to read a quote from that, where they say the collaborative nature of work that went into the construction of the images, as well as their public exhibition, illuminate Du Bois's investment in a truly public sociology. Du Bois also turned to Atlanta alumni to construct a robust network of field researchers across the South. Black women were among the field researchers who contributed their expertise and labor to the Atlanta studies. We might further speculate on how white working class patrons touring the American Negro exhibit in Paris interpreted and made meaning of this data on their own terms. Here, both viewers of the infographics and black study participants in the US South come in view as legitimate co-producers of sociological knowledge. So that's kind of a very important point that, in this grand European display, you have this kind of Deleuze and Guattard would call it re-territorialization of this Southern black life into this, from a minor discourse into a major discourse, a grand stage. This is W.E.B. Du Bois's exhibitor card from the Paris exhibition, which I think is just interesting as a typographic artifact. So he looks good in this picture, but he was really stressed out because they had to finish super quickly. In fact, in his autobiography, he writes, The details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money, limited time, and not so much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris. Nor was there a cabin left for sale, but the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in steerage and went over and installed the work. So this image of Du Bois traveling across the Atlantic in the steerage, like close proximity to the hull of the ship, it doesn't really sit comfortably with me with the image of Du Bois as this cultural elite and sort of famous intellectual, nor does it sort of reflect this idea of racial progress and modernity that the graphics themselves have. So there's like this really strange tension that it was easier for the pieces of design and art to arrive than it was for his actual body to get there. And when he got there, he would have seen this grand display, you know, picture it sort of the turn of the 20th century, the fin de siècle. You know, Europe is like, let's get out of our dreary salons. They're dropping their Victorian cynicism, pessimism, and ennui, and they're in the shadow of this 1889 built Eiffel Tower, and this is a stereograph of that tower. In close proximity to that would have been the actual pavilion. So you could think about this World's Fair as being kind of like the Venice Biennale right now, or Art Basel, right? This kind of global cultural production. And this is a printed souvenir of the American Pavilion, which, not unlike the American Pavilion in Venice, is a kind of Beaux-Arts architectural style, signaling that the US had arrived on the national stage and was positioned in close proximity to France, Germany, these other world powers. However, Du Bois's exhibition did not get the same kind of good placement. This is a floor plan of where the exhibit was in the Palace of Social Economy. It's like in this corner here. And you can actually see like there's other exhibits that are like about life insurance and like it's like trade fair. And it was kind of like tucked in the corner. And so because they knew where it was going to be placed, they had to sort of radiate a kind of sparkle and originality and cause the fair goers to marvel at the display. And this was no small task because they didn't have a lot of square footage. And I just looked recently, and I think over the course of the exhibition, you would have had probably about 30 million viewers, if I remember correctly, seeing the exhibit. So it's thousands of people per day seeing the whole World's Fair. What's interesting about the exhibit is that it actually won a number of awards, including the Gold Prize for Du Bois is his role as a collaborator and compiler of the materials of the exhibit. And it looked like this. So it was an unusual way of actually making a sociological exhibit. Instead of relying on this like diorama form, which you kind of, if you go to like a natural history museum, you know, when you kind of like see the Neanderthals and like the scene kind of in a mimetic kind of real presentation of what's happening. This is very much about abstraction and representation. So they use this information design, and the photo documentation shows that half of the diagrams are present, mounted in wing frames set on movable standards. So it actually allowed the fairgoers to flip back and forth through the plates and look at this rich data at eye level, and had all of those contributions that I mentioned earlier from those various schools, and included also suites of images, text, framed photographic portraits of prominent African American leaders and politicians. It also had Booker T's influence, since there were tools, harnesses, and other agricultural products from black industrial schools. And there's also a bronze statuette of Frederick Douglass, which you can see to the left of the image, as well as 250 publications authored by African Americans. One of the interesting details about the frames of the photographs was carved by a former slave. So there's also these traces of oppression that is like still there. And in Mabel's essay, she talks about how like this is very different than what you would call like the living displays of so-called primitive people from the African continent jungles of South America. So this is very rational, very modern, very different than what you would see. And here's an image of Du Bois's Gold Prize from the exposition. So there was this kind of material evidence of the results of what he created. And it also, the exhibition had a second life that it, when it closed in November, the entire exhibit was packed up, shipped, and displayed at a number of World's Fairs and other expositions back in the United States, gaining additional audiences, including African Americans after this international debut. So, for example, this is a souvenir that came out of the organization of a group of black club women to bring the exhibit to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. And it's clear that Du Bois also continued to think about the infographics he and his team prepared, because in 1909 he wrote Callaway and said, "Hey, I want those back. Can you send them to me?" But either he was unsuccessful or unable to secure the return. They are now digitized in the Library of Congress, and that's where these plates sit. So, are you ready for a bit of an entree? Okay. Before I do that, I want to try something different. I've never done this before, but I want you to actually hear from Du Bois himself for a few minutes, where he's sort of talking about what it's like at Atlanta University. It's from a biography, audio biography, where he was interviewed by Moses Ashe in 1961. It's actually a really beautiful vinyl record that also has inserts, but he's going to talk a little bit about the Atlanta years, and I think it gets into his motivation, and I think it's a good setup for the plates themselves.
In 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro, or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
So I think that's pretty powerful. So even as he's constructing these very complex sets of knowledge, I think part of the visuality of this work is about trying to take the information and make it actionable and make it understandable in a very impactful way. So I think it's critical to sort of get in his mindset as he collaborates with others. And it's the beginning of a lot of other collaborations. While he's in Paris, he also attends the first meeting of the Pan-African Congress in London, and goes on to have other collectives too. The Niagara Group is one that stands out, where he knows that he can't do it alone. And so the plates that I'm going to show you are grouped into two distinct but highly related sets. On the left, you see the cover plate of the Georgia Negro sociological study, and then on the right you have the series that I mentioned. They're both 22 inches by 28 inches, so they're large. They're like broadsheets or posters, and you saw the scale of them in the exhibit, so they are quite substantial. Both sets use a range of visual strategies, including geographic maps, circle and spiral diagrams, bar and area charts, and complex tables and grids, giving a vivid variety to the data. In multiple instances across the two sets, the Atlanta University team took similar subjects, such as education, colorism, and economic class, and reproduced them twice, but with different visual structures and different data, one being state data and one being national. And they used a synthesis of census data, but also their own original field research. So he and his students open the visualizations with a striking map that captures the sweeping nature of their study. There are two circles connected by fine lines that track dark areas of Africa to equally dark swaths of the United States, the Caribbean, and South America. A solitary white star represents Georgia in a wave of black ink. Though absent in the key, the gray zone suggests the migration of slaves beyond the most trafficked regions. Here, and in many of the subsequent plates, the diagram is larger than the scale of the text, while the written rhetoric matches this sort of heaviness of the subject matter. And he really uses graphic language to, in one image, visually represent hundreds of years and thousands of miles of oppression, and tracing literally through these vectors from the slave trade through the Middle Passage to emancipation and beyond. He kind of makes this argument for equality and sophistication of black Americans living under Jim Crow in the shadow of enslavement. And you can kind of we're going to scroll on down, and you can see at the bottom is that quote, right, the color line quote. And just this cartographic setup for the plates is really, he's like showing the global context of the slave trade and sort of realizing and trying to show how constructed it is, which is actually based on his PhD at Harvard, was about the slave trade. So he's kind of constantly dipping back and sort of rebooting his research and deepening it and expanding it. And then now I'll show you the cover for the other set, because they're quite different in density. And to me, when I look at this, I really see a proclamation in type and image form. So this first panel of the second series is super dense. It's self-referential. It has the mention of Black Americans in Georgia and being collectively authored, but it also has this really interesting palette of gouache and these bright colors. The principal type here, it appears to be a sans serif or grotesque typeface, which predates the 20th century, but if you actually look on closer inspection, it's actually a letter style that has no curves, only straight lines, and that's more akin to like a lettering generated by templates used for architectural or engineering plans. And based on the author's training in sociology rather than graphic design, it would make sense that Atlanta University students would have used some pre-existing tools or templates. And this residue of technical lettering is likely these metal templates that were really for like blueprints and plans. And you can see them customizing it because if you look at the lighter weights of this lettering, you can see that they have French translations, and the diacritic marks, the accents, have this heavier weight to them, so you can tell they're manipulating them. There's other symbols that were also not included, like percentage signs, that you'll see throughout the plates where they're hacking it and customizing it, including some of these like weird backslant italics that I'm using in Trey's revival. Made a decade before the rise of dominant European avant-garde movements, these works predate modular design elements often considered to have their origins in Russian constructivism, Gestalt, and Italian futurism. So this plate here, 12, is a depiction of the chronological transition between slaves and free blacks. And just visually, it's like striking, not just the color palette, which alludes to Pan-Africanism, like the blood of people, the dark skin of the continent. But there's this contrast between sharp and deckled edges. You have this, on the left, a torn black color field showing enslaved Georgians from 1790 to 1890. And then on the right, there's this geometrically sculpted red field, which shows the rise and decline and rise again of the percentages of free blacks. And just this super simply worded title that's very terse for maximum impact. And like, for me, it's almost even just hard to talk looking at this. Like, I almost just need to take a breath. It's so heavy. Here's a detail where you can see that. Just the precision of the craft which the things that are made with fine lines would have been made with these things that were called stylo pens, kind of like an early version of like a rapidograph pen that has super fine detail. So there's this combination of like expressiveness, like in the shading, like you can tell there's like a harried nature to it, but then a lot of intentionality in things. So this 16th plate, I think really typifies this idea of modular elements, which typically these composed abstract shapes are built from circles, triangles, and rectangles in bright primary colors or black and white. And it makes me think of like, you know, Bauhaus studies, even though this is 19 years before that. And just how simple and powerful, this doesn't even need a key, just two sets of numbers, and the detail of color, you know, the numbers within the red circle are shaded in this yellow tint. And you can also see a lot of pencil underdrawing in the pieces. And also Du Bois and his team use the backs of things, so you'll see like working charts of mathematical statistics because they had very limited access to paper. And the reason why the plates are still in the Library of Congress is they're on this wood pulp paper that has inherent vice that's decomposing. So these things are literally like eating themselves. It's really amazing that they've been digitized, because that's sort of when people have started paying attention to them again. And so, you know, having these published 20 years before the founding of the Bauhaus, the German art and design school that we all, not we all, but most people know, that's famous for this rigorous foundation that this program and maybe pretty much every art school in the world is sort of based on in some part or deferent to some part, that sort of focus on these foundational principles of visual form. This circle chart looks like a bullseye used in target practice, and this nested circle draws the viewer dead to the center, showing the value of all black-owned land in Georgia. And one of the things that Kandinsky, one of the painting and form teachers at the Bauhaus, would do is he would do these color tests for his students, where he would give them an outline, or actually have them draw a circle, a triangle, and a square, and assign one of the red, yellow, or blue to the shapes. And he felt like, I can't remember which is which, but like a circle should always be red, a triangle should always be yellow, and a square should always be blue, or something like that. So it's just really interesting how prescient these forms are. And if you zoom in on this piece, you can also see this, the dollar figures are in these triangular wedges that also have, it almost looks like when I was in design school, also in graphic design, you use gouache as a tool to produce flat graphics, and it actually became this tool, both gouache and placa, of the Swiss school of design education to kind of make graphic form. So there's this kind of weird ahead of its time in terms of material, in terms of commercial application of visual form, and then also, you know, watercolor has its role as sort of like a study for oil paint or acrylic in the modernist painting tradition. But you can kind of see this texture, again, to me feels like an emotional representation of like rage, or just the perilousness of Du Bois's mission, not just the time they had, but sort of the urgency of it. And there's a lot of variety in the plates themselves. So like this, which is a chart of the value of land owned by Georgia Negroes, uses sacks of money. It's pretty, like, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, to chart how much in dollars land is owned by people of color in Georgia. And this plate especially, to me, speaks to the colors and shapes and kind of foreshadowing the critical developments in the history of data visualization, including something that's simplified pictographic form that comes a few decades later in this thing called the isotype picture language, which was a set of shapes that a husband and wife team in blanking right now. Help me out. Do you guys know isotype? Anyone? Not familiar. Why am I spacing? Neurath, thank you. Otto and Marie Neurath, a husband and wife team. So it's just so cool that like Du Bois and his team were doing this before that. And the isotype picture language, like any logo you think of, like Apple Computer, or kind of a symbolic language on our operating systems, kind of came out of this isotype, but these folks were doing it before them. This next chart is about racial amalgamation in Georgia. So you can see through color, they're talking about this idea of colorism, which is the relationship between class and skin tone within Black culture. And Du Bois is this northern-born, globally educated and internationally traveled scholar. He would have been very sensitive to this idea of associating the skin tone of someone with where they sort of sit in this racial hierarchy. And he even goes quite deep into being explicit about Black being a full-blooded Negro, brown, or persons with some white blood, or descendants of light-colored Africans in this yellow. And that's also illuminated with this blood red number here. And this is a perfect example of, in another plate, in the second study, they take the same data, but it's national, and instead of a bar chart, they are in this sort of area chart with a gradient. And so you can see that the students are kind of probably working in multiple teams, and you can even see the visual language, like the typography is quite different. Using the lettering template in the first plate and the other plate, there's this letterpress that starts showing up. I just made wonder they might be under deadline and having to produce these things quite quickly. And so as I look at some of these forms, you also see unique pictographic and chart types. So Du Bois would have been looking at the work of Scottish statistician William Playfair, who created the pie chart and line chart. He would have also been looking at the work of Florence Nightingale, who was a British nurse who ended up creating this thing called the Rose diagram, which she used to persuade the British government to support medical care to British troops in the late 17th century. And so he's creating his own, like, this is not really a bar chart, and it's not really a pie chart. I would call it a Du Boisian spiral. And if you've ever seen any of the posters of like Swiss modern typography, like Joseph Müller-Brockmann, this to me looks like this abstract composition representing music. So he's just so ahead of his time, and there's so much complexity to their approach. Like, these are maps of population data by county in Georgia, and to me these look like heat maps. And there's a pretty well-known scholar, his name's Edward Tufte. He actually has association, I think, with Yale. His books are printed through Yale's press, and he's printed like 4 volumes of information design, and Du Bois's charts are not anywhere in his research. So beautiful, like it's haunting, just the innovation that they were able to achieve. I think partly not knowing what they were doing helped them quite a bit. And just the kind of the detail and the power of graphic form, along with just willing to be simple. In this plate on illiteracy, it's just so reduced. And this kind of lattice chart is another theme or chart type that he creates in this like atypical woven structure. Here, illiteracy figures and their corresponding years kind of create this lattice arrangement about property. And it just, the repeated style reflects both a necessity to be efficient and a continuing exploration that comes with experimentation in unfamiliar medium. The interleaved bars are also visually related to other curving and turning bar and spiral charts. And there's sort of this like tension of condensing data into the most economic form and leadership of a team of sociologists acting as designers in training. One thing that I did want to go, I forgot to mention, I just realized, this plate, I think it's really important to think about the data that's being represented here. So this is the assessed value of household and kitchen furniture owned by Georgia Negroes. And I think just by talking about these everyday objects of like, oh, it makes it relatable that like there's a humanity to people of color, and that Du Bois is very calculating in the variety of data that he ends up showing in these plates. And the last plate that I'll show is this very complex one that is about income and expenditure. And I just love it as a visual exercise. It's got photography, multiple tables, this complex color palette, as well as gold foil. And when you look closely, it's the last plate in the first set, you actually have instructions to the user. So he's really thinking about like the haptic experience of interacting with this frame, where it says, for further statistics, raise this frame. So for me, These visualizations offer a prototype of design practices that were not widely utilized until more than a century later, anticipating the trends now vital in our contemporary world of design for social innovation, data visualization in service to social justice, and the decolonization of pedagogy. How was your entree? How am I doing for time? Am I good? You guys doing good? I think I have like another 15 minutes. So, time for dessert. So I just feel like looking at all this work made me think about my own design history, and I think this also applies to art history as well. So when I was a student, I had two professors. One was Doug Silverfox Scott and Lorraine Fierce Wild. And these are like just the designers that I've claimed title historian that formally taught me, and there were a lot of other things I learned from. But it's interesting to sort of think about their teachers. So in the background, there's this seminal text, the first book of the history of graphic design written by Philip Meggs, and then both of these, Doug and Lorraine, were educated at Yale. In the graduate program, so they would have. He's not a historian, but figures like Paul Rand would have been there, another American designer, Bradbury Thompson. But then there were also all the European avant-gardes like Armin Hoffman and Herbert Matter that would have influenced them. And Lorraine ends up interviewing them and writing about their history of the emigration of European designers. At the same time, Lorraine takes over from the first history of graphic design course that I know of, taught at Cal Arts by Lou Danziger. And she also, before going to Yale, went to Cranbrook, which is a pretty well-known program as an undergrad, which is unusual, and would have been taught by Kathleen McCoy. But when I look at these faces, I don't really see myself represented here. And their model of history, it has a very particular form to it, and I think this is the case also for sort of most models of art history, that it's a bit of a timeline. I would call it a modernist celebrity clothesline, where the history of design or art is hung along a grid that's quite linear, and famous, mostly white, mostly male designers are represented. It usually starts with cuneiform, BCE, and then doesn't really make it out of the 80s, right? One potential other model for teaching could be this idea of choose your family. So a nodal historical network. So you might think of influences or people in your social circle, like people here at the school, right? So you can think about Walter Gropius, the director of the Bauhaus, and his student Herbert Bayer, student and teacher, or Josef Müller-Brockmann and Max Bill as contemporaries in practice, or Karl Gerstner and Armin Hoffman. Is this relating? Oh, there we go. Cool. As colleagues. So this kind of string theory, where you can kind of choose your family, like I choose Du Bois. But then I think there's these other implications too, another way that you can look at this. And I think this new research that I have has me really excited about this idea of major and minor discourses. So some of the things I mentioned, this is an image of the isotype picture language in the corner. You have Herbert Bayer's universal typeface and De Stijl painting. And so when you think about Du Bois suddenly entering this dialogue, you have to reconsider this idea of major or minor, what's major, what's minor. And you could actually take this and then apply it to an entire curriculum where you set a syllabi or a textbook and reframe the major discourse through the minor lens. For example, in the middle, you could have a lecture that's normally about streamlining in the auto industry and planned obsolescence, where you would sort of talk about Norman Bell Geddes and Henry Dreyfuss and these sort of World's Fairs that talk about the automobile as a future utopia and highways going through the United States to give freedom. If you place that in relationship to Victor Hugo Green's Motorist Green Book, where you have populations of the United States who are not totally mobile through the country without a reference guide, a piece of design that would tell them where it's safe to stay or eat in the South, that totally reconditions the conversation. And then you could look at the bigger scale too with the development of highways like the BQE and Robert Moses in New York, or Overtown in Miami, or any number of neighborhoods that have been carved up by highways and created actual urban disenfranchisement of certain peoples. And then the same thing could go for like this other note at the end, where you have in 1968, the same year that the Eames Lounger comes out, is the same year as the Memphis sanitation worker strike, right? Glenn, I did not know you were going to be here, so that's like pretty interesting. Where you have certain people reclining in a piece of design where other people are standing up with design on their chests, literally walking through refuse, which is also the same time as Tadanori Yoku has a solo show at MoMA. So there's this global discourse that's also happening, and at the same time we're having this like hippie modernism and Wes Wilson and all the Haight-Ashbury stuff. So just trying to make a more expansive history and framework, and I feel like this is already happening in things that I just want to show. 2 case studies and end with a quote for your digestive. So one is the work of students that I work with. It's blank, good. So this is a project called Mapping W.E.B. Du Bois, which was done in Philadelphia in March of this year. It was a 5-day workshop where 12 different students at the University of Arts took the research of Du Bois and made a contemporary version of it for the city of Philadelphia, where they were looking at data sets of things that were they were interested in affecting them. So things like segregation, racially inspired shootings, wage stagnation, like you see in this chart here, a history of the neighborhood, hate crimes, and we spent time mapping the city, doing derivs around the city, but also going to our archive of African American culture called the Charles L. Bloxton collection at Temple University, which actually has the original writings of Tupac Shakur in it, like his poetry and hip hop lyrics, but also has a ton of publications about Du Bois. And so the students sort of took this thing that was historical, but then were able to refract their contemporary world through visualization of information. So to me, I feel like that there, even there's darkness in sort of the history of these diagrams, that there's a lot of hope and optimism as well. That also brings me to the work of the artist Theester Gates, who in 2017 staged an exhibition at Legion Projects in Los Angeles, where you're looking at an installation view of a series of paintings and some sculpture in the middle. And if you've been not fallen asleep yet in the lecture, you will have seen these shapes before. So what this is called But to Be a Poor Race, which is actually a reference to Du Bois and his writing. And so Theester took the diagrams and he actually erased the text from them and recreated them on aluminum panels in acrylic and latex, which is this form of abstraction and stripping away the information. And he was really interested in sort of confounding the viewer in sort of being this artist using data as a form and sort of the sort of questions of the origins of them. I think there's some anecdote where he was sort of saying, are these about shootings? And I just think they're very powerful. The show had sculpture, painting, as well as a video and several ceramics. And sometimes, like in this case, the titles are the same titles as Du Bois. I didn't show this diagram, but it's sort of about the relationship of slaves and free Negroes, and it's called ex-slaves, slaves. so he kind of modifies the title, and then there's other ones where it has a totally new title, like Frenzied Negro Adventures with Red. And to me, just like the Du Bois pieces, you can see sort of this history of abstract expressionism, like a Rothko or a Barrett Newman. There's actually one plate that looks just like a Lawrence Wiener. It's pretty wild. And just the kind of intensity that he highlights and foregrounds, I think, is very powerful and very poetic. Or this piece, which he calls Mountain Aura, where he takes the colorism diagram and he says, this is where my conversation, this is Theester talking about these pieces, this is where my conversation with abstraction begins. By taking the information away, I can create an abstraction that makes people think about data. A black man with a show about data, that must be about killings. That's that anecdote. So, I don't know, I'm still kind of like digesting all of this, and I think there's just a really powerful poetry about this work, and rather than totally speak for him, I also want to show a couple of neon works that Theester made in response to these that were at an earlier show in Toronto in 2016, where he took the spiral and put it in this material. And then there's a couple other pieces that are in different shows, like one, this private auction piece called Progress, where he takes one of the bar charts, and then this other one called Progress Mill, which is actually at a show right now that's still up in Chicago till June 29th, if you can get there. But I'm gonna play a clip from a video made by White Cube Gallery, where Theester is just kind of like talking about the impact of the plates. I'm not gonna play the whole video because he's like kind of repeating things. I'm gonna have to do this to see the mouse. Hold on a second. Let's see if this works.
This logging, this demonstration of Black progress at 1900 feels no different from the work that John Johnson was trying to demonstrate in Johnson Publishing Company, where he was trying to show, look at the successful Black dentists and medical doctors and psychiatrists, psychologists, all of these amazing graduate students earning their PhDs, writing for Negro Digest in the 1940s and 50s, that I think that there's a kind of continuation of the display of Black progress so that Black people would know for themselves and the larger world would understand that Black people were doing things that mattered. And this idea of materializing progress is one of the nuanced subjects loaded in this body of work.
And so he's making reference to an archive of Jet magazine that he has in Chicago, this Johnson Publishing Empire, and there's other pieces in that LA show where he actually took volumes of Jet magazine and made sort of this visual poetry with it. So he's sort of taking these data sets and expanding and making this very complex argument for progress. And I feel like these layers of history make me think of this James Baldwin quote that I want to end with, which is he's writing actually in Ebony magazine, another sort of Black magazine, in August 1965, and it's an essay called White Man's Guilt. And he's talking about the great force of history, and I've got a passage of it here, and I'm going to just read a couple of sentences around this text that you see. White man, hear me. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, totally shady right there, on the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is in history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because therefore one enters into battle with that historical creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. One begins the attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes history. James Baldwin. Thank you so much. If you have a little energy and time, maybe we could take a couple of questions from the audience, if anyone has anyone, before we head to our, what is it called?
The roundhouse.
Roundhouse.
I'm calling it the yurt.
The yurt. Oh yes, the yurt. Yes, which is just down the hill. Does anyone have an initial response or comment?
Yeah, I got a bachelor's in sociology. I was wondering about how much data was involved with these populations and who did the tabulation. Did Bois do it, or did he have assistants to tabulate it and come up with all this stuff without the advent of computers and all that stuff? Statistical analysis and all that?
Yeah, I'll show you. Can I show you something to answer that question? I just want to show you the back of one of the plates. But yes, he had an army of, not army, but he had his students. And his alumni and graduate students, like Rogers was one of them. These women and men of color that were helping, going door to door, basically, and gathering the data and tabulating it. But the, let me see if I can find this. Yeah, totally. Okay, so this is the back of plate 31. So, so this plate, right? You remember that? So, sorry, I'm like, let me just try to do this real quick so you just see all my screen at once. Here we go, this will be easier so I don't get vertigo. Okay, perfect. Boop. Not liking that. Spinning wheel of death. But basically they did, yes, they tabulated by hand, and I don't know if anyone knows about the history of like adding machines. I don't know what they used to compute it, but yeah, this is like the back. So this would have been, these are like individual surveys, you can see. So this is like a carpenter that he interviewed, and these were his wages, his age, sex, years engaged, the kind of work, the wages. So there was this very granular level of detail, tons of data. So it's kind of amazing that they were actually able to gather all of this and, publish it and design it and share it. Great question. Other questions? Yes.
I've seen a lot of the work of Theaster Gates in Chicago, where he's bought properties and he has like custodian arts bank, and a lot of his work in the Southside community. And it's been often, I've heard of a lot of critiques of it, in saying that it's just a way to get white people to go to the Southside, and that it's basically like a form of like sure, it's revolutionary in like the eyes of the art world, but for people of like, for example, the Southside community who are not so connected to the art world, like it's not having an actual impact on that community. So I'm wondering like how you think that this work, including the work that Theaster is doing, the work that you're doing, and all these other scholars are doing on Du Bois, like what kind of impact can that have on like the contemporary
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about creating some kind of access, and like, I, I think just the fact that Theaster is like archiving these materials, like I think that's super critical as well, because like a lot of times the issue is like there is a privileged status to archives, and certain archives are retained and maintained better, and certain communities are reflected, you know, more in archives. If you think about the museum as an archive, that's also, you know, an example. I think you could be critical of Theaster in terms of like access, but I think he's doing amazing things, and like, I think him, and also, you know, I would also argue Mark Bradford and his Art and Practice Foundation in Los Angeles. There have been a series of lectures where there were curators, artists, collectors, all talking about this idea of access to the art world. And, you know, in Mark's case, he uses foster youth and training for them and supportive services to like teach them how to become part of the art world, whether it's an artist or a docent or a security guard. And I think Theaster is doing similar things in different ways. Obviously, he maintains a high-profile practice, you know, like other people in this room. But I think there's more benefit than maybe harm. But I think it's always important to sort of think critically. And even me, like I know I have like a level of privilege, but that's sort of why it's important for me to like share this in many spaces. That's like when I spoke about this at the Palms Library in Los Angeles, which was a free public event, I shared the stage with two African American women history professors at local schools in Los Angeles, and like I got schooled. Like I learned so much from them, like not just what they were saying, but their teaching styles. Like Wanda, who was sitting to my left, like she teaches with like in space. She had books everywhere and was walking around the room. She had this like easel with a timeline of Du Bois, and she was talking about how radical he ended up getting. And then Lizbeth to my right was like did a slide presentation, but just like I had like one woman of color history professor in middle school. So like just that I think these kinds of moments allow for dialogue and conversations, even if there is some privilege or status associated with them. I think then maybe you can respond to this and create your own, you know, archive that's critical of Theaster Gates. We, you know, like this space is open and available to you because of people like him. I hope that was a decent, not too rambling answer. Yeah.
Does Du Bois write or talk about his privileging or placing on par image and text in this particular exhibition?
That's a good question. I would have to. Britt and Whitney and all of us feel like this is just the beginning of looking at this complex project, and there's more writing about him in the process of putting the exhibition together. There's not a ton, at least what I've seen so far, of him like deconstructing his methods so much, which is sort of part of a lot of the labor of our research was, you know, looking through publications about the exhibition, and mostly in records from Atlanta University, his papers, and sort of the domestic response. One of the things I'm really interested in was, did this get press in Europe? You know, like did people discuss this, or with all the viewers going to the fair? And like the Bauhaus faculty were all pretty young, but like Kandinsky is the oldest, so he probably would have been like 19 or something like that when this exhibition happened. Did he happen to see this? I think it's yeah, it was because he's a sociologist. His methods that he captures are more about like the data and also the rhetoric around his message, and not so much about the form. But maybe that's something for the research to explore. He did know the importance of it, and how critical to get it right. And you can even hear him reflecting in that audio where he felt like, you know, there was always still more progress to be made. Yeah.
So, if I'm understanding right, there was just one of these
Yeah, sorry, they're one-offs.
And so was there any attempt to distribute them, to disseminate, to publish them at the time?
Well, he did. I talked about in 1909 where he writes to the Library of Congress to get them back, to keep working with them. But I think because of their limited budget and means, that's why the one-offs and just the rush. But I imagine he wanted to get access to them. And Du Bois has a whole nother series of lives after this project, including being the editor for and created the NAACP's publication, The Crisis, which has a lot of published texts, information visualization, and also design and illustration that actually at one point was led by a woman named Louise Jefferson, like one of the few women of color in design history, who is the art director of The Crisis for a number of years. So I don't know if he was too busy or just they wouldn't give him the plates back or he moved on to other things. But he did keep publishing data and research in serial form, just not with these plates. It's a great question.
It's a question about, when you're looking at Du Bois's data, there's this overarching project of, lift as we climb, kind of like progress, this notion of progress. And I was curious about when you were working with the students in Philadelphia, that kind of data is about much more pessimistic view of, it's a different project, so maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if maybe I can pull that up while I talk about that. Yeah, I found that work was very hard to do with the students because of our dystopian moment right now. And some of the things that we were looking at was what data they could gather that sort of existed already, and a lot of that is like about dark things. One of the prompts that I gave was some research that Nate Silver has done. Nate Silver is sort of known for working for ESPN as a data forecaster, but before that he had predicted elections. Didn't do so hot with the most recent presidential one. But one of the data sets we were looking at was how Philadelphia is one of the most diverse cities, but one of the most segregated ones. So as the students were kind of talking through, and then I also use this process called council, which is basically like a talking circle that is informed by this place called the Ojai Foundation, where it's sort of about discussing sort of what is truly on their hearts. And so the students were very diverse racially, and I imagine the school probably even calculated who would be in that workshop. But we really grappled with this heaviness of this data, and I think it was this kind of happened in my design history class, which I taught for the first time too, where they're quite cynical in a way that I wasn't expecting, and I kind of love them for it, but I don't know. I'd be curious to the students that are here now, because you're similar to my students at Otis. Maybe you could answer Glenn's question. Does that resonate with you, this sort of question of utopia or dystopia, and maybe how you're feeling about that now in response to these works or other things? I know that was a small question, right? Just like a combo Glenn inside. Yeah.
I think the circumstances are different, but the information and carrying the legacy of information is important. But I think it's a question for us to discern what to do with that information. Or those symbols, even distributing them and repurposing them. I think it's a matter of discerning what we want to do with that, and
just what I think, like, Du Bois his like, his graphs are very like positive and very like looking at the growth, but then I think about like how slavery just ended, and like, you know, there's like this hope and this idea of like, you know, that the world is gonna get so much better. And like, you know, he's still living in Jim Crow and things, but it's not as bad as it used to be. And like, I think that like we constantly think like, oh yeah, this is way better than like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But also like just kind of in bafflement that it's still something that's still happening. And so I think like there is like a kind of like hope for stuff, like for me specifically, but also like just, you know, like just looking at these graphs and not these graphs, but his graphs and seeing the studies and then knowing that it's almost the same now. It's kind of like what gets me to like think negatively about how like our country and like the system is like, the dynamics of the system is kind of like have not changed that much, like as drastically as it should be. So like I'm not really surprised to see the graphs that they made in Philadelphia be kind of like pinpointed on the negative, because it's like crazy that it's still something negative happening, something negative to pinpoint onto.
I think also like a critical difference, the work you were making with the students in Philadelphia, like where did they gather that data from?
Mostly internet archive, you know, public data that you could access.
Yeah,
Rather than directly collect it, because it was 5 days. You know, Du Bois had like 6 months. I had 5 days to do that.
I'm
you
not
know,
critiquing that at all.
No,
but
but
I think like
it's
there's
fair.
also that element of like, in the case of Du Bois, like this is information that they're gathering themselves, and I think like the picture someone else can build of you is always going to be different than the picture you can build of yourself. So like, if you had much longer to kind of conduct that workshop, like those students probably would have got to asking questions that somebody else in a research institution that maybe doesn't come from the same background or share the same experience wouldn't get to the point of asking. So like, there's like, when I kind of see the difference, I start thinking about like, kind of just like context and pockets of like information. And to me, it's not like necessarily, I look at the graphs then, and I look at the graphs now, and I think like, wow, the experience of being a black person in America has gotten so much worse. But I think about like, I have to get a little bit smarter about where I'm looking for validation and confirmation in what it is like being a black person in America.
Why do you say worse though?
Worse in the sense of like what it is that we're graphing. So like not even necessarily worse, but like graphs that are graphing certain things and then like graphs that are graphing other maybe much darker things. Where like that, if you're comparing, like we aren't graphing the exact same things that Du Bois was graphing. So like maybe that's a completely different picture.
I think that, like, you know, it was more from the perspective of, like, you know, Du Bois' time, like, they just got out of slavery, and, like, the amount of growth and, like, seeing all these black people in such high places just coming off the back of slavery was such an important topic at the time. And I think, in contrast, like, to where we are now, and I think, like, that's just been the focus, like, all these negative things that are happening is just so, you know, baffling, and I think that that's why we focus it on so much, because so many people want to deny that it is happening. It's like, oh, it's like 2019, like racism doesn't exist in America anymore, and and like I think that that's why it's like such a big focus to us right now. But at the same time, I see, especially in like artists, like black artists, like wanting to create this sense of utopia and like the idea of black utopia, but at the same time, all of these are like, and of course there's like real depictions of these moments, but most of these things that I'm seeing are fiction. Like the only way we, like artists, like black artists, have seen is like creating this space of a utopia, but to get away from the reality of like what is happening right now, like in 2019, like we think we've come so far, but we really haven't. And so that's like, you know, in terms of data and tracking reality, real numbers, that's what the focus is.
Yeah, and that makes me think of like Du Bois' reaction to the Harlem Renaissance and like the Black Arts movement. Like he was quite critical of a lot of those artists, even though they're amazing and prolific. Like he felt, it's like that quote he said in the autobiography, like he felt like art wasn't enough, or there was this kind of, that Afrofuturism or this sort of speculative realm, he felt like it wasn't enough impact, but weirdly enough at the same time, he was also doing the same thing. Actually, Britt and Whitney talk about this speculative story he writes called The Steel Princess, where he makes this like fictional version of a sociologist in the future who looks through this telescope at the like the now or the near now, and is sort of like trying to project a kind of utopic vision anyway. So I think there's a lot of tensions within Du Bois, and like that's why it resonates with me. I feel like I'm both. Like I teach because I'm hopeful and optimistic, but at the same time, like I keep having like gritty realities. Like this is something I was talking about at the dinner table. Like I ended up going to CalArts. I had applied to go to Yale as well for grad school and got in, but during my interview in New Haven outside of the art building, I was stopped by police and asked to see my ID and train ticket outside the building, and said that there was someone who had seen a suspicious person around, which was like problematic on a number of levels. And then the person that I was paired with, who interviewed me, a student, was the only other black student in the program. And he was doing these performance pieces in the city of New Haven where he was videoing himself interacting with aspects of the city. And I asked him, I said, Forrest, this thing happened to me outside the building. Like, is this a common occurrence in New Haven? He said, yes, I just am prepared to be stopped by the police anytime that I'm in the city doing this work. So, like, that to me is very much like the story of Du Bois, like, in the steerage. You know what I mean? He's like visionary, but then like, there's that. So this is like, coming here is like pretty awesome. Like I feel like the welcome I got here is like totally different. Like Byron's like getting things from the store for me, driving me places. I'm naked in the pond,